Okay, welcome to the 99th episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Bryn Edwards. Bryn works in the space of organisational and cultural psychology, and it's really lovely to speak to him today. Thank you, Bryn.
Thank you, Piers.
So one of the ways I do like to segue into the podcast is where I met you, if I have actually met the person. And I remember the first time we spoke on the phone, I was sat in Manchester and it was a business course I was doing, and you were one of the facilitators.
Yes.
You remember that?
Yeah, no, I do. I do, because I was completely unqualified to be on that course.
That was 6 years ago, I realized. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so amazing. So, how I would love for you to begin is just share a little bit of your journey. How did you get into the work you're now doing and around cultural organizational psychology?
Yeah, look, it there's quite an arc to it. And interestingly, a large chunk of the arc starts in boarding school. Um, so, you know, so I went to two boarding schools. I went to one in Leamington Spa called Arnold Lodge. I went there from the age of 8 till I was 13. I was a weekly boarder. I went from Monday to Friday. And then I went to one in Nottingham called Trent College, where I was a termly boarder, and I was there from 13 to 18. So I did 11 years. And, a lot of people used to say to me, "Oh, you're at boys' boarding school, and, there must have been a lot of fighting." And my answer to that is no, there wasn't. There wasn't much fighting at all. And it surprises a lot of people, because you'd think with all the boys there that there'd be a lot of fighting. But what I have to explain is that if you got caught in a fight, then you'd lost already, because someone had you. They'd emotionally had you, because the whole environment was one where all emotions have to be repressed, pushed down, shields up, and everybody's basically, just tapping on everybody's shield here and there, here and there. And so, because you're in this environment and, you can't get out of it, there's no option. And, people are tapping away and this, that, and the other. What I soon started to realize was you don't want to be the center of attention, right? Because with that may come a bit of, physical abuse. I mean, there's still, the old, I say we're not fighting, but there would be the dead legs, the dead arms, the stuff like that, right? Or there'd be the emotional abuse of just having the shit taken out of you, right? And you just don't want it, right? So what I learned quite quickly was how to look upstream from this, right? And to me, I could almost feel how some boys just ended up in the center of attention. And it just looking further upstream from it, I started to sense that when one boy spoke to another boy in a certain way, they'd create a charge, right? They'd create a charge of animosity or whatever it was. Let's just call it a charge, right? And that charge was going nowhere. It until it was discharged or expressed, it was going nowhere. And often it would just it would move through the group. And how one boy had spoken to another boy would result in probably in a fight, but probably 3 or 4 weeks later, right? So the charge would be created and it moved through the group, it'd go a bit quiet, and then it'd peak and then come around, and then it would come back to its owner, and then it would happen, right? And because you're in this boiling pot and you're never out of it, you get to watch it happen over and over and over again, right? So through not wanting to be the center of attention, you kind of pick up on it, right? And I was one of these who managed to navigate school by being one of the sort of non-conformist conformists. Like I did everything that was required, so you didn't get in the center of attention, but I had my own little space that I kept for myself. So that's how I got through, right? And it was just sensing how interactions created charges and how those charges move through people over time. And you could, because you were in it and you were going nowhere, you weren't going home at the end of the day. So the charge couldn't be dissipated somewhere. You could watch it and happen again and again and again and again. I left school at the end when, when I did my A levels, and I did a degree in psychology because I just found the outside world completely baffling because I hadn't been in it. And I found that very underwhelming experience. I got a good 2-1 degree, but I found it very underwhelming and I couldn't understand why. And it took me a few years. And then I realized that we'd spent most of our time looking at almost like the top and bottom 10%, top and bottom 5%, right? I was more interested in the middle, right? How do we live meaningful, fruitful lives, right? And then once that dropped, then it was like, well, I still would like to study some more psychology, but where do I go and find out about, regular human life and functioning? Well, that's not clinically related. It always kind of amuses me that when, we start talking about mental health, which is usually people have got themselves in a bit of, things have progressed over time. They've got themselves, pretty anxious, depressed, whatever. But we're not talking about, clinical cases, but we bring out clinical psychologists to talk about it. And to me, it's like bringing out a brain surgeon to talk about a migraine. It doesn't add up. But anyway, so the only two choices for me to study further was either sports or business, right? In terms of regular people, not clinical application, for master's degree level. And I thought sport was just a bit too narrow, despite the fact I'd done a lot of sport myself. And I thought, well, most people go to work. It'd be an interesting place. So I did a degree there, a master's degree up at Youre in Manchester. And again, it was a bit underwhelming, but we did have the world's leading expert on workplace stress at the time, a guy called Professor Carey Cooper. So this was in 2000. And I really resonated with this idea that spaces that you're in can cause damage. And that really just like, oh, right. Because I'd been in a strange space that was causing damage. But, I, like many ex-boarders, was not ready to face up to that. It's like, oh, well, there was that thing, but it was pretty good because look at me now. I was still in that phase. The unwinding of that didn't happen until 40s. So this was really interesting. And I also drew the link with, well, if an organization is causing damage to individuals, then also the damage to the individual is an indicator the organization is not functioning. So there's like a dual thing, because we're in business here. So, there's business and there's duty of care, both at the same time. So, I could hold the two at the same time. So after I did my master's degree, I tried to talk to a number of organizations about this. And let's be honest, it's like 21, 2001, like we weren't talking about workplace stress there. Like it was just so far down. And, we had just had 9/11 not long, like the week before I graduated. And so nobody really wanted to talk about it. And as much as I tried over a year, it was just like, oh, I might just have to pop that on the shelf. So off I went off into the world of corporate management consultancy for 15 years, doing change management and this, that, and the other. But again, things that happened at school were showing up in the workplace, such that I would sit there in amongst leaders of organizations making rational, data-driven decisions that were going to implement the next best practice. And yet something inside of me, I sensed that if you move that decision, and I can articulate it now, but what I was doing was I was moving that decision through time, through the people. And quite quickly, you could sort of go, well, most people are not really going to like that because it involves change or this or, you know, there's a disruption to their job, and most people just want to come to work, earn some money to get by, you know, irrespective of whether they tell you they love their job. Everyone's doing some sort of emotional gymnastics of reconciliation to, you know, trade off the fact that they're spending the best years of their life and are just doing stuff to earn money so they can live in a nice house. And so that's going to have a charge. And that charge is not going to go anywhere. And so to start with, you're going to see an increase in performance, probably from this decision that managers made. And then it for 3 or 4 months, and everyone will go, oh, it's great, it's great, it's great. We'll look at the measurables, and then it'll plateau. And then the reality of what's happened with the charge of the people will start to kick in, and then it will come down, and you'll probably end up in a net negative position. Now, the difference here was, you know, the fight scene that I was talking about in boarding school, that had probably a cycle time of 2 to 4 weeks, right? And over the course of the year, you'd have another bigger cycle that was moving. So by the time you got to summer term, things got really, really Larry. But with these things, you're talking more 12, 18 months of a cycle time. So you've got to be in and around a project for a while. So, you know, there I am, latter 20s, starting to sit in the room of these decisions, early 30s. And I'm sitting there going, I'm not sure about this. But then, you know, the smarter people around me are going, no, it'll be fine. And it wasn't. You know, you'd be on a project and it's 12, 18 months, you'd be where I thought would be where I thought I would be. And you go through a couple of the cycles of this, and it's difficult to articulate because it's not, you know, it's not the rational thought. It's the rational thought that's not helping here, right? But how do I rationally put together the fact that I'm sensing moving charges through people? And then it finally got to the point in my latter 30s, start about when I turned 40, that I was at a smaller organization, and I just, enough was enough. And I just sat down and wrote a report and just sort of extrapolated out on things. And a lot of them, you know, wrote a report which got disregarded, and a lot of things came true. In the background to all of this, so this was happening. And then in the background, I had my own midlife crisis between 38 and 42, which is fertile age for it. You know, I could talk about that for hours if I wanted to. But, you know, I was a poster boy for a cliche midlife crisis. And so I felt, so my relationship with my daughter's mother imploded. And then not long after that, before I went to this second smaller organization, I saw my consultancy career implode. And in the middle of that, I had these very humbling experiences where I suddenly sat in this small little dingy apartment by myself thinking, I really don't know who I am and how I work and how I got here. I just had this sense that there were deeper waters that were moving, that were me. And I'd gone so far away from them, and I was snapped back by events. And so that's when I started after a period of time after that, I wanted to know if that happened to other people. And I wanted to know if these similar patterns sort of occurred for others, because I sensed that there were bigger patterns in life. And so I embarked on a podcast for 4 years and interviewed over 200 people. I'd listened to everybody and anybody who would talk. 85% of them were in person. And really, everybody thought it was this thing, you know, connectivity and build a network and commercialization and that. Really, it was the longitudinal qualitative research study into the patterns of life that no university would offer. So I just did it myself. And it didn't take long before I started to sense patterns and things moving. And, you know, people would say one thing, and then you could tell that they were going to bring up something else later on. I wouldn't know what it would be, but it have these elements. And this went on for 4 years. And then synchronistically, I met a lady called Roslyn Snyder, who, before she came on the podcast, asked me, what's it really about, Bryn? And I said, Ros, there are patterns. She says, well, what do you see? What do you sense? And I told her, and she sort of said, well, you're nearly there. And I was like, what? And so I interviewed her the following day, which everyone can listen to, the 2.5 hour extravaganza, where she talked about Roslyn's, to say she's a psychologist would be putting her in a box because she's many things, but she's predominantly a psychologist. And she's developed a theory called realm theory, which is a comprehensive framework of how we work as living entities. And it looks at the universal principles and patterns that we all follow. So it provides, an interesting perspective of not just what goes on within the person, but between people, and then what surrounds them. And this is what became super, super interesting to me. So I went and did some training with her, and then I hoodwinked her into a mentorship for 3 years, to immerse myself in that. And everything seemed to come together. This idea of what's going on within me, what goes on between me and people, and then what goes on surrounding me. Because we like to, in our, industrialized, individualized way of being, we like to isolate things. We talk about in the business world EQ and IQ and this stuff. It's silly because we're emotional beings and we're thinking beings, and they all link up together and they all interact. They're all connected. And your psychology is not just impacted by what goes on within. It also goes on what goes on between people. And it's also, you are influenced by what surrounds you. And so I got to this place now where, essentially as an organizational cultural psychologist, we work at the intersection between the surrounding culture, the relationships between people, and what goes on within them. So in a business setting, that's the organizational culture, team dynamics, and performance and mental and emotional health within it. And so it really picks up on what I had to learn to survive at boarding school of reading charges, which we all do. And it's understanding what is culture, how does it work, how does it influence us, how does it influence our relationships, how does it influence what goes on within us, how can we start to work out what's ours and what's not ours, which is really important when we start to look at healing from traumatic and abusive situations. What is mine, what is not mine? So then I can delineate what's going on in the culture around me, what's going on in the relationship around me. Is it mine or is it not? Because if we don't have that delineation and sensitivity, then we can't clean up our own patterns. We can't clean up the patterns in our relationships, and we can't clean up the patterns in the spaces surrounding us. So, typically I have sort of three entry points for clients. I have organizations who want to clean up, or community groups, who want to clean up toxic cultures. We have team leaders who want to clean up the dynamics of their team. And I have individuals who come and they either want to build more life-affirming patterns that follow the life patterns that we as living beings, the same as plants and birds and everything else, follow, or they want to clean up destructive patterns and heal from trauma and abuse.
Thank
So
you.
there you go.
Wow. Wow. Interesting. I love what you say about, us looking within and seeing what's mine and, what's mine and what's theirs. And I almost feel Nick Duffell talks about, I know you interviewed him on your podcast.
Yes.
This idea of projection. I almost feel as trauma survivors or boarding school survivors, we often put most of it onto other people. Oh, it's them. It's not me. It's someone else.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. See, this is the trick. This is the missing point that most of us overlook, is that often we can be picking up dynamics that are occurring within a relationship or within a surrounding culture. And in the same way that we pick up charge, like our feelings, our emotions, and they go nowhere, right? Let's just be crystal clear. You can, you know, I was born and raised in England. I now live in Western Australia. We haven't covered that bit. I now live in Western Australia,
Yeah.
which will make for an interesting part of the conversation later. As much as the British culture is to avoid feelings, sweep them under the carpet, and go nowhere near anything difficult, as I've learned myself and seen in our clients, that they go nowhere, right? They just build and build and build and build. And we experience that within ourselves, but it happens within relationships. And relationships, although you can't see them, they still store these charges, any animosity. And so that's what, they need as much cleaning as we do individually. And surrounding cultures, similarly, they need as much cleaning as we do. And so this idea that you can clean up the toxic culture of an organization by just chopping out the leader and putting a new one in is absolute folly. Because if you leave charges to fester over a period of time, they'll create a pattern. And then that pattern emerges, right? And this was kind of what I was picking up at school, and what I was picking up as a consultant is everybody was looking at, oh, well, these are 5 just things that have occurred. They're not related. And up here, but this sort of level 1, if you look at theory U and stuff like that, up here, they absolutely do look unrelated.
What's
But you
theory
put them
you?
down. Theory U is something that a guy called Otto Scharman put forwards, that we have 4 different levels of listening and we have 4 different levels of conversing. And the top one is just downloading and spitting out information. The second one is that we will start to agree and disagree, and we'll see where both of us sit. The third one is the one that we seldom get to. Right? It's the one where we wish all the news reporters and political reporters would take us, but they never go because they just like to stay at level 2 in the arguing. Level 3 is looking at how do things connect.
Mm-hmm.
And level 4 is what's flowing through it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's when we connect to the level 4, that's when we feel what's going through it. And we all have this capacity. Some of us have learned to disregard it. Some of us learned to ignore it. But we all have an experience of walking into a room and going, fucking hell, you could have cut that with a knife's edge. And that's what you're picking up. That is what you're picking up, right? And it's very real, and people disregard it, but it's very, very real. And when we start to work with that, which involves not just our rational 10% thinking and doing, when we involve all our 100% of us, which goes down into our deeper thinking, our feeling, our beliefs, and then our core energy patterns, and then our core, that's when we engage all of that. That's when we start to sense things. And we all have the capacity to do that.
Thank you. I love those 4 levels. First,
Yeah.
giving information, then back and forth, and how do things connect? Yeah,
And then it's the spirit, it's what's flowing through something.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess, I mean, one of the things when we chatted together via message was about the dynamics of colonialization. And maybe we're going straight into it, but I'd love to hear, because I've been reading Caroline Elkin's book, The Legacy of Violence. It's kind of present, in the British Empire, but not just the British Empire, just European culture for 1,000 years, what we did.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to speak a little bit about
Yeah.
use of
I suppose like all things for me nowadays, I can talk to it through the lens of my own journey. And predominantly that's my healing journey, and then my integrating, and then my developing journey. So it's not something I've put together through necessarily intellectual pursuit, if that makes sense. And this is kind of key, because this is a key part of understanding realm theory and understanding how we work, is that we're in our lives all of the time. This idea of, oh, I've done a lot of work on myself, which is a phrase we hear a lot. It's kind of folly, really. You're either doing work in yourself or you're not, because you're in it all of the time. You're in your emotions, you're in your thinking. So this idea of having an objective third-party place where we look at stuff, it doesn't kind of work. So I can talk to it through my journey of how I got there, because it covers some interesting ground. So part of the mentorship with Roslyn was to start to acknowledge, express, and release the big emotions that I was carrying, the big emotions that I'd stored up, the big emotions that I'd locked in a box, the emotions that would sneak out in destructive patterns when I'd been drinking, or when I was annoyed, or when I was just doing life. And so inevitably that journey of purging big emotions would take me to, some of the stuff that I was feeling as a 7-year-old when I got dropped off at school. And which was at a time when I really didn't have the faculties to be able to understand what I was going on and stuff. And so, there was a particular exercise I would repeat, a process that I would repeat. And a lot of our stuff is not so much talking. A lot of it is either rapid writing about stuff, or a lot of it is painting, just intuitively painting. And then all of a sudden you look at the painting and you think to yourself, I know exactly what that means. And it's ever so strange to start with, but after a while, you can talk about the painting because what's in here has come out, and now you're looking at it. And believe you me, Piers, none of this is performative Picasso style stuff, right? Sometimes I just read on a page like this, 10 minutes. And there was one in particular where I just got black, and we're talking paintbrushes that 3-year-olds use, and just done black for ages and 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 ages. And then just grabbed another piece and just went abandoned. I was like, fuck. Wow. Fuck, there it is. Like, I'd worked it all the way up, the energy of that emotion, and you do have to feel it, right? You can't think your way out of these places, right? So there I am doing abandoned and stuff like that. And so inevitably it takes me to that. And so over a period of time, I discharged a lot of emotions that I was carrying. And so that started to create a lot more space. Then I attended, then having done that for a period of time, I attended Roslyn's healing trauma and abuse workshop, right? And it was hilarious because I was thinking, Ros sort of says she doesn't tell you what to do. She just sort of goes, oh, I'm running a trauma and abuse workshop. Do you want to come and try it out? And I was like, well, I tried most of your workshops. I'll give it a whirl. I mean, I'm not carrying trauma and abuse, am I? Anyway, yeah, within half an hour of sitting in it, I was like, oh, I need to be here. Oh, I need to be here. And what I was able to do, and this is a really important part of the journey, an important part of talking about colonialization, and the thing that we need to understand about it was what I was able to do in that workshop for the very first time was we all have this part of us, which is, is our spirit, is our essence, it's our core. It's the part of us that was created when your dad's wiggler went into your mum's egg and there was a spark. And that spark is you, right? That's the part of you that's indestructible from start to finish, right? but a lot of shit gets attached to it,
Mm.
right? Just from doing life, let alone going to boarding school, right? And so for the first time ever, I was able to start to understand how traumatic and abusive, and there's different, we have a different interpretation for both, and I'm happy to share that in a minute,
Mm.
because things can be traumatic and they can be abusive, but they can be traumatic without being abusive, and abusive stuff can be not traumatic as well. And it's important to understand the difference, particularly on a healing journey. And so for the first time ever, we all have this sense sometimes inside that there is just a part of us, a beautiful part of us, that we either yearn for it, or we get glimpses of it, or something like that. But it is there. But it just gets covered with shit. And the shit is all the marks and all the scars of all the events that have occurred. But they get covered in these big emotions. So you can't even get close to them. And then through doing just these very intuitive exercises, I was able, over the course of 2 days, we were able to surface the patterns that we had individually, all the people in the room, individually have, just taken on to work our way through these abusive or traumatic experiences, and how they're turned into patterns, and how and the impact that they have. So, just to be clear, we weren't getting into the story
Mm.
of where they came from, because the story doesn't help. Retelling the story will re-traumatize, or it gets us stuck in a loop. This was being able to move past that, which doing the work before had helped. But we were able to surface the pattern, see where it impacted our relationship, our thinking, our feeling, our beliefs, the places we hang out in, and how it had basically structured our worldview. And by surfacing it and going through a few intuitive exercises, I was able to, for the first time in my life, just get a fraction of daylight between those patterns and that part of me, my core. And it was like just a fraction of daylight, but that was enough for that to start to move apart. More stuff came off, and more stuff came off, and more stuff off. And then I began to gain a greater connection to this part of me. And, a lot of this was happening in 2022. And I had the opportunity to go home to see my parents and my sister for the first time in 2.5, 3 years post-COVID. And we had this beautiful experience where one night we had this family dinner, the four of us, and my sister went to school as well. And for the first time ever, and this is the gateway out of it, but I sat around the table and we'd finished eating, and then this thing came up, and it's like, oh, fuck, I've got to say something. I don't know what it is. I won't know what it is until it's leaving my mouth, right? And I sat around the table, and I just sat there, and I looked at my mum, my dad, and my sister, and I said, I know that you all love me dearly, but I also know that I've not made it easy for you. And I'm sorry. Tears, everyone's tears. And it was recognizing the fact that I'd been a prickly bastard because of all these patterns that I'd created. But I saw daylight between me and those patterns. And then I could see what those patterns had done to the people around me that love me. And so, yeah. And then I was able to have a conversation for the first time ever about how me going to boarding school had impacted my mum and dad. I never thought about that before.
Mm.
So, then this then starts to open up a conversation about, well, why did you send me?
Mm.
And, you know, there's an angry, before all of this, there's an angry little 7-year-old trapped in there somewhere who really wants the answer to be, because I didn't love you, right? because you're a little shit. We didn't want you. We just want to abandon you. Because then that would just vindicate how the 7-year-old's been carrying on. But the answer is something different. The answer is we thought we were doing the best for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, where'd you go with that? Where'd you go with that? We loved you. We missed you. We cried when you left. Like mum cried for a whole year when I first went, and these are the stories I wasn't ready to open up to because I was consumed in all mine, rightfully so. So then this gets me thinking of, well, why, what was it that made them think that they were doing the best? Right. What is going on? And so now I'm starting to look at the culture. Now I'm starting to look at what's in the culture, and at this time, I'd already done the interview with Nick some years before, which preceded meeting Roslyn, but he'd started to talk about how boarding school had influenced the leadership of the United Kingdom. And as soon as he mentioned it, it was crystal clear, like, oh, you can see a direct line through them. And the more I started to understand patterns and how patterns replicate within cultures, you can say, oh, yeah, well, you just took in this and put it there and what have you. But then there was something that was probably even more profound that started to come in on the journey. So I'll sort of park that bit with your parents. I live in Western Australia. I've been here since 2010. And Western Australia is pretty unique place. Like Perth it's the biggest, most remotest village on the planet. We're all by ourselves on the other side of the island from the other end, where there's Sydney, Melbourne, everybody knows that stuff. But Perth is pretty much by itself. And, in a landmass state of Western Australia, which is 11 times the size of the UK, we have a population of 2.4 million. And 1.8 of those live in metropolitan Perth, and the rest live out in that vastness. It's also interesting because Western Australia has got some of the oldest rocks on the planet. So it could be argued it's one of the first pieces of landmass to be formed on the planet, which has a lot. It also has the longest continuous culture on the planet of 65,000 years with the Aboriginal Indigenous people here. And also it's probably one of the last places to get colonized by the British. We know that Australia as an entity is like 200, 225, 230 years, something like that, old. And that colonization was taking place on the East Coast, but the colonization on the West Coast came a lot later. So it's probably only 100 or so years. So what you have really is you still have, although we have a significant social issues amongst Aboriginal communities. And I can probably come back to that in a minute. You've got a line to, people who lived in an Indigenous way not all that long ago, right? And this is where, now I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm not trying to sport with you, but I'm asking you because I'm also asking anybody who listens to this question is, do you understand the difference between an Aboriginal and an Indigenous person?
I don't know if I do, to be honest. I know. No, I guess I don't.
No, and a lot of people don't, right? An Aboriginal person is a person who lives on the land of Australia, and they live in an Indigenous way. And by Indigenous, we're meaning in line with nature, in line with their nature, in line with the nature of being a living entity on the land that you're on. We spend a lot of time in small, so I run this small workshop that helps people just start to orientate themselves within their own psychology. And it starts off with going, right, so where are we today? Oh, we're in such and such a business. Yeah, and where's that? Oh, well, it's on, you know, St. George's Terrace or something. All right, where's that? In Perth. Where's that? In Australia. Where's that? Well, Southern Hemisphere. And where's that? On the planet. Yeah. And where's that? In the universe. Right. Cool. So there are certain laws of the universe that came about to create the planet. And there are certain laws of the land, of the planet, that brought about life. And there are certain laws within life that brought around people, right? And if when we choose to disconnect and ignore those laws, that's when things go wrong. So it's not surprising we have an enormous mental and emotional health problem. Because one of the things that I sort of point out is that unless we're in that clinical band, most of our mental and emotional health problems are appropriate responses to ways of being and doing and organizing that don't have life as the central organizing principle. So we're like, you know, we're like canary birds in the mine shaft, and we're worried about the canary bird falling off the perch and wondering whether we can, you know, what do we need to do to look after the canary bird, and forgetting the fact that the real reason the canary birds come off the perch is because of the toxic surroundings.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, not everybody wants to embrace that line of thinking. So what you've got coming back here to Western Australia is you've got this line to a group of people, a continuous group of people, and by continuous, it's 65,000 years of passing on traditions and stories and ways of being, ways of doing, ways of organizing. They're in tune with the land and in tune with themselves and the community. And, you know, the more you get into it, the more you realize how delicate but sophisticated and subtle it was. And so you've got this going on, right? And here I am, I'm British, right? We're the mob that came down and colonized, right? And so I'm like, well, why did we do that? Why did we do it? And at the same time as well, so there's these things going on at once. At the same time as well, in most workplaces here, there is the challenge of how do you attract and retain Indigenous talent? Because it's difficult. And I started to think, well, what is it about how they do life that means that they struggle with the workplace? And then I started to go, well, it's an incapability to maladapt and not adapt. Adapt is something that we do in a life-affirming growth way, but we can maladapt. Like you and I had to maladapt in order to survive boarding school. We had to cut parts off, we had to send parts away, we had to do what we needed to. So that's maladapting. We didn't adapt to it, we maladapted to it. And it's an important distinction. And so then that got me thinking, well, why is it that us white fellas are so bloody good at being in the workplace? Shit, we're really good at maladapting, aren't we? Why have we become so good at maladapting? And then you start to look at boarding school. You start to look at your parents thinking it was a great idea to send it to them. And then I remember one day when, you know, we're having a light-hearted but pointy conversation about, oh, you know, the British came and they colonized and this, that, and the other, and da, 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 da. And I suddenly sat there and went, well, it was a question I asked out loud. And it was as much to the people I was with as it was to myself. In that, I was like, well, those British people that came down and did all this colonizing down here, were they, are they actually Indigenous English people?
Mm-hmm.
Or were they colonized? That then sends me off on a little history trip into the you know, the history of England, you know, because, you know, we're a proud nation, kept the Germans at bay through the World War II and stuff like, you know, Royal Britannia and all of that. You start peeling it back, peeling it back, peeling it back, peeling it back, you know, looking at where the different royal houses have come from. Most of them from Europe. But you peel it back even further, and the island was first colonized by the Romans in, was it about AD 40 or something like that? And they were around for about 400 years, right? And our we've seen cities like Mumbai change their name from Bombay to Mumbai, and places like Sri Lanka change their name from Ceylon back to Sri Lanka because that was their actual name before they were colonized. And the name Britain, Britannia, was the name that was given to the island by the Romans when they first colonized it. So when we sing Rule Britannia, we are celebrating the fact that we got colonized 2000 years ago, and we celebrate that. The island's name actually before that was actually Albion, and there was something like 14 tribes that lived in a more, should we say, indigenous nature. And it's like, it's kind of important because going back to the question I asked you earlier on, do you understand the difference between Aboriginal and Indigenous? I could have asked you, do you know the difference between like the Samis in Scandinavia? Or I could have asked you about, native Indians in North America. What's the difference between that and Indigenous? Is the fact that they lived more in line with how we as humans operate. And just because, I went to a boarding school and I came from England, and I lived this what on the outside looks privileged life that was laced with trauma and abuse, does not mean that I don't have an Indigenous, nor does it mean you don't have one. You do. I do. We all do.
Nick talks about that, doesn't he? Nick Duffell, he says the inner Indigenous.
Yes. Yes. And it is our inner Indigenous. It's how I use a lot of tree metaphors for a whole variety of reasons. It's the difference between, you have two trees, right? And one is allowed to grow as it can, as it should, in line with all the knowledge and information that it, and knowing that it has in its seed before it cracks, and then it grows, and then it works out how to grow and be in the space around it, and it does it as it should do, right? And then you've got a second one, it grows and it gets trellised. It gets tied here and it gets tied there and it gets tied there and it gets tied here, right? And so it's sort of forced growth. And over time, it'll try and follow its path, and it might move and snap a branch, or the trellising might fall away, and then it becomes weak, And that's kind of what we saw during COVID, when a lot of the anchors that we use externally were taken away from us. I know me by going to the gym. I know me by going to the cinema. I know me by the restaurants I go to. I know me by the bars I go to. I know me by the recreation I do. And now I can't do any of that because I'm locked down. So who the hell am I? Well, you've been trellised. And whilst we all have an inner Indigenous, we also need to realize why we're not in touch with that, because colonization isn't something that just happened to the Aboriginal people within the last 150 years. It's something that's been going on for a long time. And we are colonized. We are, nowadays it's all industrialized as well, but we are colonized. And you've got to go back 6,000 years to start working out when this colonization game started.
I love what you said there about the Aborigines struggling in business. I think it's Nick again in Wounded Leaders. He talks about, I think it's Will Hutton's work, The Economist, and he said that the British Empire didn't collapse; it morphed into the corporate world. And when
It did.
when I worked in the city, and I was back in the city a few months ago, I'm like, oh my God, I'd not understood that the city, the financial sector in London, it's just like boarding school. You're not allowed to show emotions. You're not
100%.
allowed to show vulnerability. No joy. It's like,
Yeah.
wow, I hadn't thought.
Well, I'm not like I'm probably simplifying it a bit, but from my understanding, the British Empire rose through commercial reasons rather than the monarchy saying this would be a good idea. Monarchy jumped on board with it, but you had companies like the East India Company and stuff like that, and that was a driver of it. But then it became a big thing. So that links up with what you're saying. So so by so this is really important because if we are in spaces that are causing damage, and you and I have spent time in something that's almost like the zenith of full on damaging spaces in terms of its we talked about it's been talked in terms of your developmental arc and all of that. Okay, but this thing is still happening. You're right. It's happening in workspaces all the time. The same things. In Australia here, we have, because mining is such a big thing and they have to go to remote places, we have what's called FIFO workers, fly in, fly out. So someone will fly in to a mine site or a gas or LNG facility, and they might be there for 2 weeks on and 1 week off, right? And they go up there and everybody has to wear the same, everyone's wearing a uniform, Piers.
Really?
Everyone's wearing a uniform. It's called high vis. But everyone's wearing uniform, right? So individuality's gone, right? You might have a name on uniform. And then you're up there, you're in these dongers, which are these small little units. You and I remember exactly what they're like. You'll eat together, you're doing this, you're doing that. And now, guess what? They're surprised because there's mental and emotional health issues, and there's sexual harassment, and there's all sorts of these destructive behaviors happening. And I was talking to people recently about this. Were you surprised? They're like, well, have you worked in the FIFO industry, Brett? I'm like, no. They're like, well, what do you know? And I said, well, let me just ask you a couple of questions, right? When you work in the FIFO, do you go through this cycle of being at home, then being a bit tense because you're going to the site, having to pack your bag, saying goodbye to your family, friends, bedroom, places that you're comfortable, the clothing that you like wearing, all your comforts, all the things that you gives you home. Say goodbye to that, put on a uniform, take a bag, go on a journey to another place, be in the other place, be told when it's time to piss, told when it's time to sleep, told when it's time to eat, told when it's time to work, told when it's not to work, told when it's recreation. And then you have to abide by those institutional rules for a period of time. And then you get let out, and then you go home. And then it takes a while for you to chill out, but then you do. And then just as you chill out, you realize you've got to do it all again and go around in a cycle like that. And they're like, yeah. And I went, that's what I did at boarding school. I drew that cycle, right? As part of my healing journey, I drew that cycle of what it was like going round and round. And when I finished drawing, and after a while, the cycle just turned into one black line because there was no shields down at home because there was no point because we're going to have to come back up again as soon as you like, especially when I got to terminally boarding. And by my rough mathematic calculation, I worked out that I went round that cycle somewhere in the region of 240 times in 11 years, right? And the difference is in FIFO, you're choosing to be there, but you're not because you've got to make a living. So it's a false choice. I mean, at least mine was like, you're off, no choice, crystal clear. Whereas this is more insidious because it's all the same thing.
It is.
So, so these patterns are repeating left, right, and center. And so a big part of you know, because like acknowledging that there are mental health issues is awesome. The fact that we're at that place now, it's great. And, you know, acknowledging that things like boarding school were not good for us, you know, is awesome, right? And, you know, you and I are probably in the same boarding school survivors Facebook group with 5,000 or 6,000 people, right? And it's awesome that people have a place to go, I don't think this was right. But the challenge is that that's awesome, but then we get stuck, right? And then it's like, well, okay, so what does that mean? I'm fucked for the rest of my life. No, no, you're not. And this is where we have to face up to some big stuff, right? This is where we have to face up to the fact we have an indigenous, right? We have ways of being. There are universal principles and patterns that we need to follow as individuals and collectives of living beings and living entities, right? There are ways of being and doing which are destructive, and we need to understand those. And they masquerade as things like nowadays as, you know, global capitalism and stuff like that. Okay. Or they could be called patriarchy, but really it's colonization, right? And it follows a very simple path. You isolate, and then after a period of time, that isolation causes fragmentation. And then after a period of time, the fragmentation leads to disintegration. You know, in order for us to navigate school, we had to isolate ourselves. We had to fragment things off. We had to fragment our emotions off by repressing them or whatever we needed to do. We had to send parts of ourselves away. Doesn't matter where they went. They just went away. We put them somewhere. They went with us. And that's how we, you know, that's how we navigated ourselves. But then we continue this process, and then we get to 38, 40, 43, that sort of period of time. And there's another one around about 55, 56, 57. So I'm turning 50 this year. So I've got one coming. But and that's when this fragmentation has just got to this point that it's like, well, it's unsustainable now. We need to disintegrate some stuff. That might be disintegrating your understanding of yourself, or it could be more serious, and you become suicidal and disintegrate your life. And so, you know, it's important to understand these things, because that's how we can then begin to understand, well, if I'm stuck and I'm here, but we have an indigenous, and this is how we should operate, then we can understand how we can heal ourselves.
How do we connect to that inner indigenous? You know,
how do we do it?
Yeah.
Well, the first big bit, so we at Wisdom in Your Life, the company I work with, where I do the organizational and cultural understanding, we sort of have 3 steps. We've got 3 workshops that we take people through. Ros has been rolling these out for 25 years. The first one is called the map, right? And it's a very simple metaphor of how we deal with change and how we navigate through the emotional landscape and where we get stuck. Because by and large, we don't do emotions, right? We put them down. You know, it's interesting. Someone said to me recently, because my fiance is back in England, and so I was quite sad because she's going back for 7 weeks. Sad because I'm going to miss her. And so I was quite teary and I was quite sad for a few days. And so I said, oh, you've been a bit emotional, have you? I'm like, I'm emotional all the time. We're always emotional all of the time. Whether we choose to push it down, that's our tactic. So the first bit is getting used to being in our emotions, you know, and they're not something to be scared of. It's something to, you know, it's where the joy of life is. But we just get so scared about bad emotions that we shut down, and then we shut down all the good emotions and we become empty. Or we go in them and we don't know how to navigate them, and we get sunk. Or we hang out on the edge where it's safe and we start blaming people and getting angry. Or we just disconnect. Okay. And these are places in the map, right? And so we help people to understand that, you know, the key to swimming your emotions, as we call it, is to acknowledge them, express them, and let them go. So in our mental health journey we talked about earlier on, we're at that point of acknowledging. but we're not really expressing them very well, and we're certainly not letting them go. So the first part is getting into that, right? Because if we can't even do that, we're not going to get anywhere. You know, you can't do healing without facing up to some big emotions. It's just, they're there. They're there. The second part is starting to get a feel for your nature. And we use some metaphors for that. And then we understand, and by your nature, this is also where your knowing, your intuition, your inner knowing comes from, you know, and there's a difference between knowing and having information. Right. A lot of us read so many books and listen to a bajillion podcasts and stuff ourselves full of information, but we don't have a lot of knowing, and we seem to have mistaken cleverness for wisdom. Right. It's easy to be clever. It takes effort to be wise. And so the next part is connecting to our core. And we call that our compass, right? And it's connecting your nature, starting to get a sense of, well, yeah, actually, like take for instance, this was a nice revelation for me. Like, I played rugby at school. I was in the first 15. We were very successful. I went on and played for Leicester Tigers youth. I then went to university, played a whole lot of rugby, did a bit of men's rugby, and then stopped abruptly, just like that. And it always flummoxed me, and carried on watching rugby and stuff like that. And then recently we had the World Cup, right? And it's on in France. And the games were on in the middle of the night here, so I just couldn't be asked to be up for them. And then all of a sudden, letting go of rugby in the World Cup felt like a relief. And I was like, well, why is that? And then all of a sudden I realized, well, why did I ever like rugby? And then I realized two things. One, it's what my dad did. And which little boy doesn't want to be next to his dad doing the things that his dad does? But then here's another thing, right? If you're at boarding school and you get in the team to play rugby, what happens? You play against other schools. And if you play against other schools, what happens? Your mum and dad come to watch.
That's true. Yeah, my dad, I was likewise on the first 15, and my dad used to come and watch. He never used to
Yeah.
speak to me. He used to leave before, the
Yeah.
finished.
But which boarder doesn't want to see their mum and dad?
Oh, yeah.
Deep down, everybody wants to.
Yeah, yeah.
So all of a sudden I was like, do I actually like rugby? And then the answer came back. It's like, no, I fucking don't. Not at all. Not at all.
Wow.
And the weight was just like, so this is what I'm talking about. By actually connecting to my actual nature. And then you start to feel like, oh, what do I actually like and what don't I actually like? What bits, what part of me has become something I thought it should be in order to meet the demands of the outside world, and which bits of me are actually mine. So then once you understand how to navigate your bigger emotions, so you're less scared of them, and you start to develop what I refer to as a level of existential strength, which means that, depression can come and go, anxiety can come and go. You might even know, as I've incurred, even not so long ago, that, suicidal ideation can come and go. But, that, to use our analogy of, the black dog knocking at the door, as far as I'm concerned, the door's always open for the black dog. No, our door is not closed, because the dog will come in, the dog will go. I know what I need to do, not to shortchange the dog. I need to acknowledge the dog's there, listen and express, and then I need to let it go. And out the back of that, I'll understand what I've lost or what I need to learn. And so when I can do that, and then I start to connect to that part of me, I start to get a little bit of a sense of that little part of me that's the core part of me. Then we can go into looking at these patterns. And then that's when you have the wherewithal to be able to lift them up. And our healing trauma and abuse, or clean up and tune up program, sounds like the heaviest thing in the world. But by the time you get there, it's actually the lightest thing in the world. And letting them go is actually really easy. And, we often say to people, you'll end up having 3 tests afterwards. And it's always kind of funny how life wants to push you back into how you were. But Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So, so it's, and it's the something I mentioned earlier on in terms of delineating between trauma and abuse is really
Mhm.
important because, again, one of the things I like to do. So we're living beings, right? So as far as I'm concerned, the life that flows through me is the same life that flows through you. It's the life that flows through that plant there. It's the life that flows through the birds and everything. We're all alive. We're all sentient beings. Uh, we have life. We have an energy that runs through us. And there's a great metaphor, which is, I could bring we could bring a bicycle in here now. We could take it apart and put it back together again, and it will function perfectly because it's an inanimate object. But I can't do that with me. You can't take me apart and then put me back together again and expect for me to work because I'm more than parts. There's something else that flows through me, and that's life, right? And so, there's a story that Einstein came up with this theory of relativity by considering what it'd be like to sit on a light beam and how it would travel. And so I like to do a similar thing of consider, how does life flow through me? What is it up to? What is it up to? How's it flowing through you? What is it up to? How is it flowing through all of us? What is it up to through all of us? Because there is a certain magicalness about life.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's a certain bigger thing, and we can stick names on it or whatever. I just keep it simple as life. Life is flowing through me. So when we consider how life flows through us, then we can start to look at things like trauma and abuse. So one of the ways that we define wisdom in your life, Ros defines trauma. The difference between trauma and abuse is trauma is a loss of control, and abuse is a loss of power. Right? Trauma disrupts our natural pattern of how life flows through us. Right. So it disrupts it. It might put a block in here or a block in there or something like that. Abuse is more a case of as the abuser, as the perpetrator, I take something from you. So I take part of your flow of life or something, and I take a bit, probably because I've been abused already. And so someone's taken my bit. And in the process, you have something removed. Probably I give you a restless part of me that's not mine, but it's like, and also probably in the process as well, you may well have sent parts away to keep them safe as
Mhm.
well. This makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
But this is really important because with trauma, it's a disruption to how life flows through us. So, that may result in disconnection, or it may result in lack of balance, right? Lack of balance between our feeling and our thinking and our doing. It may result in a disconnection between our thinking and our feeling, right? A complete disconnect as life flows through them normally. There's a disconnect, or it disconnects us from our core, or it disconnects us, from our connection to the land. Abuse results in almost like a contamination. Now I take on something now I have something that's not mine, right? And I feel like I'm missing a bit. A part of me has been taken, right? And the perpetrator, this is really important in the context of boarding school, because a perpetrator doesn't necessarily have to be an individual. It can be an institution,
Mhm.
right? So, being dropped off at school for me was quite traumatic, right? But it wasn't abusive. What went on in the institution of having my power taken away from me was abusive. And so once I got my head around this and I was able to understand what parts that I'd taken on board that were not me anymore, you know, I was taking on feeling patterns and thinking patterns that weren't mine.
Mm.
I was taking on ways of being and doing that weren't mine. Then I could start to understand how they were replicating. So I had this massive thing for ages, Piers, where I just wanted to work for big organizations as soon as I'd done my master's degree. So I went to work. I went to work for some of decent corporate management consultants, right? Turner and Townsend, Accenture, places like that. Why do I want to work for a big organization? Because I want to work for a big institution, because I was used to being in big institutions. It was replicating again. So I had to spend some time cleaning up and giving back what was not mine to its source, taking back what was mine, and also inviting back some of the parts of me which had gone somewhere else. And it's not getting to where they went right now, but they went somewhere else. They weren't here, right? They weren't here with me in time and space. They went some there. And so a large chunk of time was spent bringing those parts back, again, through very intuitive, easy exercises. And so a big part of the healing journey is bringing the parts of yours that are back, the flow of life. Like some people will resonate with the idea of going to see energy healers or something like that, right? But if we consider the flow of life like a river, we often get preoccupied with the water, obviously, but the water flows where the banks and the beds point it. And it's kind of the same within us. We have banks and beds, and a large chunk of what we end up doing at Wisdom in Your Life is helping people to allow the sort of indigenous direction of the banks and beds to recorrect themselves, and they will recorrect themselves. We do heal ourselves if we allow ourselves.
If
Through
we
some
live in
simple,
a culture, I guess also if we live in a culture which allows us to flow.
yes, yeah. So we can do an amount of healing for ourselves, but you start to heal for yourself, and then you start seeing things that are around you. And the more you can look deeper into yourself and understand, okay, so I cleaned up some of my patterns, but now I see some of the patterns that have surrounded me in the boarding school. And now I started to clean those up. Now I start to see some of the patterns in my family that are around me. Clean those up. Now I can start to see some of the patterns in my community around me. And, the deeper you can look inside yourself, the deeper you can look into the outside world. The two are interlinked. You can't unbalance them. You can read a lot of books and trick yourself into thinking you can see deeper into the world. And so this is how I was able to understand the presence of colonization, because I had to sit and acknowledge to myself that I'd been colonized by being in places like boarding school, by being raised in Britain, by being part of the Western world. I appreciate that I'd colonized. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not sitting here now going, we should all, what most people do think at this time, which is, I need to go back to huts or something like that. No. I think there's a third place for us to go to, but we've not invested enough time in that. And that would be a topic of conversation for another day. But right now, the most important thing is us healing ourselves, because that's how we then begin to clean up the spaces that are surrounding us. We're not going to get very far cleaning up the spaces surrounding us if we haven't healed ourselves. We don't understand how we work, then we can't look deeply into the world. I wasn't able to start to look into the world and see colonization. I wasn't able to have a frank conversation with an Aboriginal person and talk to him about me connecting with my Indigenous. Here I am, an English dude in Western Australia, talking about connecting to my Indigenous. Like, on the surface, on paper, I've got no right talking about that. I've got no right talking about that. But I have every right as a human being on the planet.
Yeah.
So
I've heard this before, that in order for us to move forward, we've got to look behind us in order to take the step forward. And a lot of us just want to look forward, but we've got to learn from our ancestors learned from the Indigenous in order for us to take the step forward, not to do away with the old, but what can we learn before we step forward?
Yeah, but the learning will come from connecting with it in yourself. It
Mm.
doesn't, yeah, we have to sit and listen to people around us, but it has to come from honestly facing up to how it has impacted you in your life. And we're not ready to see, you know, it's pretty full on what I've just talked about for a lot of people. And some people will come with me so far, and some people come a bit further, and some will come even further. Not everybody's ready to come on the entire journey, but a lot of people by this point we're gone, oh, I was with him up to here, and then after that it's just talking, and that's okay. Like, it's fine. Because yeah, there are like key steps along the way of how we become colonized and how we become engrossed in the destructive mindset. And the big part of it is that we see it as normalized now. And the idea of anything different is not even perceived.
Mm.
You know, I can, yeah.
Yeah, normalize, and then for the boarding school, it's privilege. It's
Oh,
the
you've
opposite.
wrapped it up in an even bigger bow now, haven't you?
Yeah.
You know, like I keep saying to people, how do you stick privilege and trauma in the same sentence? I,
You
you
can.
know, how as a British person in,
It's a double bind, because you kind of,
yeah,
you're told, normal experience, don't separate from your parents, you should be as close as possible. And then the next moment, don't spend any time with strangers.
yeah,
And suddenly you're in an institution with strangers
I
and you
know,
don't
I
see
know.
your parents anymore. And then you're told, well, it's good for you. It's a privilege. You're like, what? That doesn't
Oh,
make
what
any
this is
sense.
supposed to be right, but I deep down I fucking hate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and look, there is some simple, like in terms of our indigenous, there's some very simple principles, right? Individually, right? We are social, we're emotional, we are inquisitive, right? We are. It's just how it is. Okay. And a tree doesn't spend the whole day, an English oak tree doesn't spend the whole day having an existential crisis, and I wish I was a birch tree, right? Um, and similarly, when I talk people through the map, initially I use the tree metaphor again of an oak tree knows that in the spring it's time to stick out buds and start shooting leaves, and then in the summer all the leaves are out and we're doing all the photosynthesis, we're storing all the sugars, and then in autumn it's time to crispen off and drop them, and then in the winter when the winds come and the rain comes and the ground is less firm, you know the tree's not going to collapse because it's got all these sails trying to blow it over, but at the same time it's storing up its water for in the summer when there's less water, and then it gets to spring and the cycle starts again. And the tree knows just intuitively that if you follow that pattern, things will go well. If you start dumping the leaves in summer and putting them out in winter, it's not going to end up well, right? And then we look at the trees and we go, oh, and they're lovely because they're the pattern and da, 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 da. And then we ourselves go and ignore our own patterns. And then we think that everything will work out all right. You
Mhm.
know, you know, when things change, we have an emotional response. We have to acknowledge, express, release that. And then at that point, then we can reflect. And then when we've reflected, then it's time to understand what we can do. And then once we've understand what we can do, then it's time for us to make a decision. And then we start again. Right. If we try to go straight to thinking, it doesn't. So, we're social because we're all connected. We're emotional and we're very, very inquisitive. We're
Mhm.
always inquisitive. So if we're sitting there in a cubicle doing the same thing, it's not helping us inquisitive. And then collectively, we work in a connected, circular, collaborative fashion. Again, let's look at trees in a forest. You don't get the birch trees and the oak trees going, well, no, mate, we'll just keep a bit of sugar here and you're not having any. And no, it's all connected under the ground in the mycelium network. and it all works as one entity.
Did you
But
know
they're all
about
independent.
beech? Certainly, I think most trees, the mother tree,
Yep.
will give her nutrients to the smaller trees underneath her. So,
Yep.
uh,
Yep. Through the mycelium network, which itself takes 20% of the energy in order to. So it's all it just works. It's interesting because I've started exploring that metaphor because, as an organizational psychologist, you think, oh, well, what's the best example of an organization that works well? And you suddenly realize, well, business, isn't it?
yeah.
Right, business, isn't it? Um, oh, trees and forests are a bloody good example.
Yeah, great.
You know, And so there's a lot to learn there. I'm sure there's a book. I'm sure there's a small ebook for me in that,
Mm,
ex extrapolating that metaphor into the business arena,
mm,
um, or just any organization.
mm,
But yeah, so we work in a collaborative, circular, connected fashion, right? And again, when things work out like that, things go really well. When we isolate and fragment, then we disintegrate.
mm.
We individualize and put things in hierarchy and make them compete, it doesn't work well.
No, no. So moving forward, as we try and, as we start wrapping up the
Yeah.
podcast, what's your vision, moving forward?
Um, well, the vision is really the vision is really simple at this point in time, is that it is for those people that resonate and those people that are drawn in and connect with me, is to take them through this very simple process of starting to being able to navigate emotions, connect to their core, and unwind patterns, destructive patterns, right? I've had a fantastic gentleman called Corey, and I'll name him because he'll watch this, who I met in January, and we've been on a great journey together. And shortly at the start of it, he said he wanted me to do some work with him. And I said, well, I'd love to, Corey. But the problem is you're not here. You're there all the time. He goes, what do you mean? And I went, you're there. So what do you mean? And he was like slightly agitated. He went away and he spent the whole day trying to be present and here. And he realized he couldn't because you're getting distracted by, motions and patterns and things. And at the end of it, I think it's 2 weeks after he did the healing trauma and abuse clean up, tune up workshop with us. 2 weeks later, he rang me up and goes, oh my God, I know what here is. I'm here all the time. I'm not distracting myself at all. I'm in the middle of it all. I'm in the middle of life. He goes, it's hectic and it's brilliant. And, I want to hang out with more people like that. So I want to create my own little forest to start with. Right. So the first bit is that more people who resonate with me, hop on a plane, come down and hang out in Western Australia for a couple of weeks, right? And we'll go on a journey. And yeah, but that then gets me to the second part, which is without going too deep into it, is that it started to occur for me in the podcast. Most of my podcast was one speaks to two and we listen to two, but towards the end, one would speak to two and they create three, and three got really interesting, right? And it's when you're following stuff. But the problem was that just as it was getting somewhere interesting, it might just, there was a flow, there was an energy. You probably experienced this.
Mm.
Is that just when a conversation is expanding and taking a life of its own and everybody's part of it, it might just tread on the toes of one of your sacred cows without realizing it. And because you don't know who you are and manage your emotions and this, that, and the other, it collapses and it's gone. And I can't help thinking that some of the challenges that we face collectively, pardon me, are beyond the horsepower of one individual, mental horsepower. And so we need to learn to come together in a level of coherence, and then we can open up spaces for things to move. And I experienced that in the workshops that I've run. The reason why Ros is so very keen that people go through quite lengthy mentorship with her and do the work for themselves. Beyond the obvious, well, if you can't heal yourself, why are you doing a fucking workshop for somebody else? But the other thing is that we're not just managing the individuals in the workshop, we're managing the entire group. And the entire group is an entity, and the entire group has a flow to it. And so the vision for me is as simple as get more people to this place. And it's difficult, you know, it's difficult because people don't realize what they don't know. But then when they get an inkling to it, it's usually when there's a disaster, that's when the opportunity opens to speak to people, that they're confused or lost. That's when it's like, oh, you should give this bloke I know, Bryn, a ring. Go and have a cup of tea with him. Like, you know. And I get people ring up like, I told her I should have a cup of tea with you. Really? Why? Because I'm like, you know, I don't know how to talk about it. Yeah, cool. So if we can move more people that, and then for me, enjoying my tree metaphor, which really resonates for me and helps me to understand my core, I can create more of a forest, and then we can see what the forest can do. And it really is, and we can start to clean up some cultures as well. And we start to clean up some space. And it really is as simple as that for me. You know, it all sounds whoa, but it is as simple as, you know, create people around me that are here in life, like properly in it, not dissociating.
Thank you. Thank you. How do people find out more about your work or get in touch?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
I'm there. You can find out more about you can find Roslyn on there, Roslyn Snyder, who owns Wisdom in Your Life. You can check out our website, wisdominyourlife.com.au. And yeah, look, if any of this has resonated and anybody wants to, like, oh shit, Bryn, you know, and look, you don't have to come all the way to Western Australia. We've got a few bits and bobs that we can do on, but you should come anyway because it's a really unique place. But you know, like, we're doing this through Zoom. If this has resonated and it's opened up, then look, I'm always open for a yarn, right? Chit chat. A yarn, as we call it down here. Of course, original people call it down here. Good yarn. So just reach out. Like, LinkedIn's the best place. But yeah, look, I'm have to say, Pierce, I'm just so grateful that you gave me the space to share this, because you know it's a testament to you that you can get people like myself on and just let us go, and talk. Not all the circles that I frequent can handle all of this. So I'm super grateful for the space you've created for me to talk and share. Even the process of that has connected things for me, helped me to integrate some things along the way, listening to myself. And and I also want to thank you for what you're doing with the boarding school space, because it's so needed.
Thank you.
It really, really is. And like, hats off to you and everything you're doing around that, and particularly with the film and everything. Like, remember when you sent your first YouTube picture of you, it was before you had the beard, on YouTube, just trying to make sense of what had happened to you. And it was beyond words, because all of this is beyond words.
Yes.
Words are a great conscious tool, but they're not the tool to go into your unconscious. And this is where most of this damage has occurred. It's like putting a screw in with a hammer, right? It's not the right tool for the job, which is why we get people doing things like drawing or poems or stuff like stories. But just to watch that and the bravery to actually say what you were saying, it was just like, fuck. And now look, so I applaud you and thank you so much for the opportunity and for what you do.
Thank you, Bryn. Thank
I mean
you.
that.
So a pleasure. It's been lovely speaking with you today. And I'll put links to LinkedIn and to Roslyn's website into the description so people can find and learn more about you and your work. So bless you.
Yep.
Been a real pleasure.
You too. Thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye bye.